I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see the PowerPoint, and I will finish my introduction once I have that shared. All right. So today we are going to be talking about mandated reporting and getting our eyes on kids during this COVID crisis. So I just wanted to start with an introduction of myself. I went to Edinburgh University. If you're not familiar, it's one of the state schools up in Erie, Pennsylvania. And after I went to Edinburgh, came down to WVU to do my grad work. I have a master's degree in social work and public administration, and that was my introduction to West Virginia. And I absolutely fell in love with the state, as well as fell in love with my husband, who was going to WVU for his grad work, and had the opportunity to move home to Marshall County, where we've been since 2007. So career-wise, I started with the Child Advocacy Center as a forensic interviewer, and then I moved to CASA, and I've been with CASA for the last 12 years. If you're not familiar with CASA, we're an organization that works with children in the foster care system and presenting to the judges their best interests. So I get to work with so many amazing colleagues in the fields of child welfare and prevention. So over the past 12 years, I've really started to understand that my heart is with prevention. I really want to help families to address problems before removal from their homes is necessary. And that's kind of how I got involved in the process of teaching these mandated reporter trainings, which I've been doing for a while now. So on the call today, just so you guys know who's all here, we have teachers and higher ed professionals, we have school staff, administrators, I saw principals and superintendents on the list. We have counselors, psychologists, school social workers, legal advocates, child advocates, domestic violence advocates, CASAs. Say hello to all my CASA friends out there. We have home visiting programs, nurses, prosecutor, and people are from all over the state. So when I talk about the things today, I want you to realize I'm talking in generalities. I'm hoping to apply the material to all of us and all of our work that we do with children and families. So sometimes I'm going to be more specific as it relates to teachers, and I want all of you fellow social workers to think about the material and how we can apply it to our work as well. So we're going to do questions and answers at the end today. I'm gonna just go through the presentation, and then I will field questions at the end. If you're putting questions in the chat box, I cannot monitor that during this process of screen sharing. And so my wonderful co-hosts are working on that. And like I said, we will get to those questions. So today we're exploring special considerations due to COVID-19 when we talk about getting our eyes on kids. We're going to talk about our agency's responsibility to learning and understanding our responsibility for mandated reporting. We're going to talk about signs and symptoms of abuse and neglect. We're going to talk about how to handle disclosures, and then how to report suspected abuse and neglect. So according to the Children's Bureau Administration for Children and Families, in 2018, my statistics come from, you have more than 3.5 million children who are the subject of investigation. 678,000 children were determined to be the victims of maltreatment. In total, 60% of those victims were neglected, 10% physically abused, 7% sexually abused, and more than 15% were victims of 2 or more maltreatments. Additionally, children who experience maltreatment are often affected by other adverse experiences, such as parental substance abuse, domestic violence, and poverty. In an email I got just this morning from the Court Improvement Project, it reminded us that West Virginia has the highest number of CPS removals per capita in the United States. 80% of our removals last year involved parental substance abuse. So we know neglect is pervasive in our state, and that is certainly true in my caseload. I cover 4 counties up here in the Northern Panhandle. So substance abuse, domestic violence, chronic neglect. Those are the primary types of abuse that we see. However, we want to make sure that just because physical abuse and sexual abuse are a lower percentage of cases does not mean that they are not extremely important for us to understand how to prevent and also make sure that we are doing early intervention and reporting. So child abuse and neglect has been linked to higher risk of health problems, such as high blood pressure, diabetes, and other chronic illnesses. They can impact cognitive skills, cause attachment and social difficulties, post-traumatic stress and behavioral issues. And even after maltreatment ends, it's possible to reduce, it's possible to reduce the incidence of child abuse and neglect through prevention approaches such as counseling, concrete support in times of need, social connections, and tools to stop maltreatment before it starts. Early intervention is the key to reducing these ACEs. Today, because of the coronavirus, millions of children across the country are dealing with physical distancing and social isolation, which can be very dangerous and deeply harmful to children already at risk of abuse and neglect. So what I'm asking for us to do today is to think about how we can keep a watchful eye on our children. It's not just for us to think about. It's not just moms and dads, teachers, or social workers. It's all of the people across our communities. It's helping mail carriers and delivery persons, the grocery store clerk, the drugstore cashier, grandma, the virtual teacher, the next door neighbor. We want to help everybody understand how we can best be neighborly during this time. Reporting abuse and neglect is everyone's responsibility. For all of us, everyday life has been turned upside down. However, for a child who's experienced the trauma of abuse and neglect, it's another season of turmoil. Because of isolation and lack of social connections, potentially poor mental and emotional health. For health and safety reasons, we have courts that are closed, CPS has restrictions, we have daycare centers that are closed, after school programs that are not happening, educational activities that have been stopped. So let's talk for a few minutes about how we're going to get our eyes on kids during this pandemic. So I'm going to offer a few different ideas, but mostly I loved listening last week to the town hall where we heard from people across the state about ways that their schools and communities are accessing students and families. So if you weren't on the call from last week, I really strongly encourage you to go back and watch it because the information shared was just fantastic. Porch visits are a quick, easy, friendly version of home visits. These visits truly occur on the porch, the curb. They're not inside the homes. They give the opportunity for us to build relationships. And so they're a great way to use social distancing and following those CDC guidelines, but having an opportunity to get eyes on kids. Again, a quick look at the news showcases so many different ways that we're keeping in touch with kids. Googling how schools are doing that across the country is how I came upon this one. There is a link on the bottom of this slide that gives you this porch visit guide, and this school is actually using it as a way to build relationships before the first day of school starts. So getting out and introducing school staff to the students and families and building that relationship. Food distributions are another way that we can get eyes on kids. So if you're involved in your food distribution programs, we want to make sure that you are peeping your head in the window, making eye contact, be engaged with the family during pickup. Ask mom and dad, how are you doing? How are you coping? What kind of resources do you need? Can we can we access you to something that you're not sure about? You know, other than food, what do you need help with? During food distributions, many of us are reporting that we're seeing families that we've never seen before. This is, you know, it's having an impact on a different level of kids than the ones that we normally see coming for free food pickups and things like that. We have families who are going to soup kitchens for the very first time in their lives. They haven't had to ask for help before. They might not feel good about asking for help. They might be worried about the stigma. You might not recognize these families because lack of eye contact, grabbing their food and going, not engaging. Or maybe they say things like, I hate to take from somebody else that could use it more than me. Engage those families and talk to them. Find out what's going on. How can you help them? How can you reduce the stigma? How can you make sure mom is taking care of herself enough to take care of her kids? Because that is such an important part of this. The stress of parenting while working from home is impacting you know, people in every socioeconomic status. So our Partners in Prevention team in Marshall County worked with our school system to connect with families. And we used flyers that were handed out in our food distribution. So this is a flyer that we had in the beginning of April. So usually in April, we do a lot of community activities around Child Abuse Prevention Month. Because those activities couldn't happen, we moved to doing the flyers. And then that kind of grew to doing flyers every single week at our food distributions. And so every week we had a different theme. We did self-care for parents. Again, if parents aren't healthy, then they're not able to take care of their kids properly. We did teen issues. We did social, emotional welfare of children. We did ideas for connecting with others, how to have a good summer in the process of COVID, you know, restrictions. And then we made sure to provide contact information for the agencies and resources that were local to our Marshall County community. Just another way for us to make those connections. All right, so moving into our mandated reporting portion of the presentation. I want you to think about your work agency. I want you to think about your community of faith, your church, your synagogue. I want you to think about your volunteer activities, what civic organizations you're involved with, and any coaching responsibilities that you may have. We know as people who work with children in our community, we usually have multiple roles that we play with our families. Do those organizations and places that you work and volunteer in have policies around abuse and neglect reporting? Is there training for what that means? And this means training for staff and volunteers. So let me use our baseball association as an example. Our baseball association has a rule. That rule says they must report suspected abuse and neglect. But do our volunteer coaches know signs and symptoms of abuse and neglect? Do they know how to make a report? Do they have training in bystander intervention? Pretty difficult to go and talk to someone that you coach with or a parent of someone on your team about concerns that you have. Does your church have a safe sanctuary policy? Does your church offer training on what that even means? Do they offer training every year for new members and new Sunday school teachers and new people involved with your church? That's what I want us to think about today. How can we make sure we don't just understand signs and symptoms of abuse and neglect, and we know that we are a mandated reporter, but let's think about how we can make sure that everybody within our community understands abuse and neglect. I put up here the Department of Ed, the link to their webpage. They have the online modules there that people can watch, and they're so well done, and I encourage you to take an opportunity to go and watch those. So why is it important that we're making sure that everyone in our community has access to abuse and neglect training? 1 in 10 children will be the victim of child sexual abuse by their 18th birthday. And more than 90% of the time, children are abused by someone they know. This is someone who's supposed to protect them. It's a person of position of trust or authority. Early identification of victims and strong support can reduce the impact of those ACEs we talked about earlier. Child sexual abuse prevention efforts solely focused on educating children are not grounded in the realities of sexual abuse. Telling a kid that their body is their body and nobody should touch it, or if they feel uncomfortable, they should come to you, isn't enough, because the people who are violating those boundaries are people that we've told those children are okay to trust. So we need to also educate our adults and the people and the systems that are accountable for the safety of children. And only when all the adults are creating a system where perpetrators don't find it friendly or easy to access children, will we be able to combat this 1 in 10. So giving you an opportunity not to have to hear my voice for a solid hour, I'm going to use this video here to present the signs and symptoms. It's a 5-minute video, and it comes out of the state of Maryland judiciary.
In this video, we'll define the types of abuse, including physical, sexual, and emotional, and discuss how to recognize their signs. It is important to keep in mind that a single indicator is not always proof of abuse. Be on the lookout for patterns or suggestions that there might be a problem. Physical abuse is the use of physical force that may result in bodily injury, physical pain, or impairment. It includes hitting, beating, pushing, shaking, kicking, slapping, pinching, choking, pulling hair, and burning. The definition also includes inappropriate use of drugs or physical restraints, as well as force feeding, reckless driving, and physical punishment. What are the signs of physical abuse? An obvious sign is if the individual makes a specific complaint about mistreatment. Other signs to watch out for include unexplained or poorly explained injuries, such as fractures, sprains, dislocations, internal injuries, or bleeding. Pay attention to bruises, bites, cuts, sores, burns, scars, or head trauma. Another sign of physical abuse can be a sudden change in the victim's behavior, such as aggression, withdrawal, regression, substance abuse, depression, attempts to escape, wariness of physical contact, or fear of certain places. Signs of physical abuse also include sudden loss of weight, teeth, or hair. Be concerned if the person under your care and the people around them have different explanations for the cause of injuries. Another red flag may be if he or she seems afraid of or wants to avoid a particular person. Pay close attention if you notice frequent or suspicious hospitalizations, or if there are delays between the onset of an injury and seeking medical care. Sexual abuse is non-consensual sexual contact of any kind. It includes rape and molestation, but also any sexual conduct with a person who is unable to consent. Both women and men may be victims of sexual abuse, and children and people who have physical or cognitive disabilities are particularly vulnerable. So are people who lack social support or are isolated. What are the signs of sexual abuse? One clear sign is if someone specifically communicates that they have been sexually abused. Other signs include reports of genital or anal pain, irritation or bleeding, and difficulty walking or sitting. Watch out for torn, stained, or bloody underclothes or sexually transmitted diseases. Behavior changes may also be a clue to possible sexual abuse, such as inappropriate, unusual, or aggressive sexual behavior. Also keep an eye out for bedwetting or changes in sleep patterns, such as over or undersleeping and nightmares. Is the person under your care suddenly afraid of the dark and avoiding undressing? Is he or she wearing extra layers of clothing? All of these could be signs of sexual abuse. Emotional abuse is the infliction of pain, anguish, or distress, and is sometimes called psychological abuse. Someone may cause emotional abuse by using verbal assaults, threats, or insults. This type of abuse also includes intimidation, humiliation, and harassment, but may also be more subtle, such as isolating a person from their family, friends, or regular activities. What are the signs of emotional abuse? Of course, a specific complaint is a clear sign, but there are less obvious signs, such as significant weight loss or gain, depression, confusion, agitation, and withdrawal. Pay attention to unexplained rashes, hives, facial tics, stomach aches, or elevated blood pressure. Other red flags may be new nervous habits such as biting, rocking, head banging, bedwetting, and thumb sucking. Anyone can be a perpetrator of abuse. Most victims of abuse are harmed by someone they know, such as family members, acquaintances, dating partners, or caregivers. Remember, it's important to distinguish between types of abuse. The signs of physical abuse, for example, are different than the signs of sexual or emotional abuse. In any type of abuse, the perpetrator may be anyone and is often known by the victim.
All right. So let's recap each of the types of abuse. Physical abuse is the non-accidental physical injury of a child, intentional harming of a child, and excessive use of force and reckless endangerment. An example, Robert was observed with a golf ball-sized bruise on the upper part of his arm. Robert reports that he fell off his bike a couple of days ago, but Margaret, his little sister, reported that the dad hit him with a beer bottle, which caused the bruising. So when questions are asked, the explanation doesn't make sense or contradicts with somebody else's explanation. Sexual abuse is engaging a child in any activity for an adult's own sexual gratification. Any act of sexual assault, abuse, or exploitation of minors. Sexual abuse encompasses a broad range of behaviors and may consist of many acts over a long period of time or a single incident. Example, Lily has been residing with her paternal uncle for several months. She's been seen at MedExpress at least 3 times in the last 2 months to receive treatment for a UTI. After further examination, it was shown that her vaginal area is red and swollen. She appears fearful to return home with John and is guarded with information when asked. Neglect. It's the most common form of child maltreatment. Neglect is the failure to provide for a child's physical survival needs to the extent that there is harm or risk to the child's health or safety. Physical neglect may include, but is not limited to, abandonment, lack of supervision, lack of hygiene, lack of nutrition, lack of shelter, lack of medical or dental care, lack of required school enrollment or attendance. And it's important to note that in West Virginia, under our West Virginia law, the failure, refusal, or inability to provide for the child is not due primarily to a lack of financial means on the part of parents, guardians, or custodians. So that just reminds us that poverty alone cannot be the reason that neglect charges are filed. So examples, physical neglect. Johnny, a 3-year-old, has been observed playing in the street on a daily basis. There's never been a parent or adult supervising him when he goes outside, and the street where Johnny plays is a busy intersection in downtown Charleston. Medical neglect. Sarah has asthma and is prescribed an inhaler. She has had 3 asthma attacks in the last 2 weeks at school. But Sarah's mother, who has been contacted numerous times, has still not sent any medication in for the inhaler. EMS has had to be contacted for all 3 attacks. And in one of those incidences, Sarah was kept overnight for observation in the hospital. We don't know if mom is following up with a medical appointment. Educational neglect. Levi has missed 90 days of school this year. It's known that he has ongoing attendance issues since the 2nd grade. His parents have been to truancy court, but they have not made attempts to correct the behavior. His grades are poor due to these excessive absences, and there's possibility of retention. And emotional abuse. Emotional abuse is the systematic diminishment of a child. It's designed to reduce a child's self-concept to the point where the child feels unworthy of respect, unworthy of friendship, and unworthy of love and protection. Holly and Marvin, parents, have been using methamphetamine for the past 5 years. Their use has escalated to the point that they are using meth and cocaine in a living room in front of the children. The children have access to paraphernalia, such as needles. And on a daily basis, Holly and Marvin can be heard frequently threatening to beat the children if they don't quit crying. This flyer here is going to be provided in the materials from today. You can duplicate it and hand it out. This was created by Andrea Dar in the Handle with Care. This is talking about what are the signs and symptoms and gives you the hotline information. So that you can post it in your agency, organizations, churches, that type of thing. So what should we do when a parent or child discloses? We want to recognize a child's attempt to communicate their concerns. Children are going to ask questions. They might ask questions that are designed to deflect that it's about them, that they're just kind of wanting to ask general questions, or maybe they're asking for a friend type situations. They might tell a part of what happened. They're going to be checking your reaction. And so it's really important time for us to kind of understand how our facial responses look. What is our reaction? How do we feel about this material and talking about this material? Because kids will definitely shut down and refuse to tell us more if we respond emotionally or negatively. So I'll give an example of a little girl I worked with several years ago. In this case, the little girl was removed from her home and placed into foster care based on allegations made from an older sibling. So an older sibling had disclosed that she had been sexually abused by their father, and that she did have concerns that her younger sister was being sexually abused because she had reached the age where the older sister's abuse had started. So we kind of had this feeling that maybe this little girl had been sexually abused, but she had never disclosed. She had a CAC interview, she didn't disclose, she was in therapy, and she talked about all different kinds of things, but she didn't talk about sexual abuse. But there were things that she was doing physically, things that she would mention that just gave us this idea that probably there was some validity to the fact that this child had been, at least at the very least, groomed by her dad in the recent months before their removal. So what I started seeing in my interactions with this child was that she would ask me questions like, what happens when I tell you something bad happened? Or, you know, is this something bad? Should this be something that your dad does? And so I call it baiting. I don't know if that's a really great question, but she would kind of string me along asking like these little questions here or there, but I didn't want to push her. I wasn't her therapist. I was not her CPS worker. I was her CASA. And so, you know, I just wanted to be there and build a relationship with her so that when she was ready to disclose, she knew that she had safe people and that she could talk to. And eventually she did disclose. And what I would just continue to tell her was that you know, anything that made her feel uncomfortable, then she should, you know, be able to tell us, you know, that her dad did something that made her feel uncomfortable, or she wasn't sure that was an appropriate thing to do. So just encouraging her that she was in a safe place. So when I would talk with her, we would find opportunities to talk away from her foster home so that she could talk to me in private, but always observable and interruptible. And we're going to talk about that later today too. So all our interactions with children should be observable and interruptible. So I could sit out on the back porch with her and have conversations. We could sit at the dining room table while we played a game or colored in a book. We could even go for walks around. They had this beautiful property, and we would go for walks in view of her foster mom looking out, the window from the kitchen, that type of thing. So we can still have privacy, but observe this rule. We want to reassure the person making the disclosure. I believe you. I'm here to listen to you. I'm not going to interrupt you. I'm not going to put my thoughts into your mouth. I'm going to let you tell me your story as the expert in your life. As soon as I can, I'm going to write down the facts, the words exactly as stated to me. Okay, these exact words are very important to investigators. We're never going to promise not to tell. And that's a really important thing. From the very beginning of our relationships with children, they should understand that our job is to help keep them safe. And in the process of keeping them safe, we also have to tell the people that can help, law enforcement, CPS. So when she would say things to me like, what happens if I tell you? I would remind her, my job is to help keep you safe. I have to tell Miss Becky, that was her CPS worker. So if you told me something that you were not safe or that something happened to you that was not, was a danger to yourself, then my job is going to have to be to talk to Miss Becky about it. And then I'm respecting their confidentiality by not telling people that don't need to know. So this isn't a conversation that happens in the lunchroom. So as if I was a teacher and a child was confiding in me, I would tell the people that I needed to tell, the school social worker, maybe the principal, but I'm not going to tell all the teachers at the table in the lunchroom. I'm going to tell the truth. I'm going to be specific. I'm also going to tell the child what's going to happen next. And if I don't know, I'm going to be honest about that. I'm not sure what happens next. I know my job is to keep you safe and I need to report this to, my boss. I don't know what's going to happen next. I'm here for you. I'm going to keep checking in with you and let you know what's happening or, checking to make sure you're okay. We need to assess the child's immediate safety. Okay, if a child reports to you at the end of the lunch, at the end of the lunch shift or something, ask the child who they go home to. Is that person someone that they're going to encounter, as soon as they get home? Be supportive, and then report the disclosure within 24 hours. We're going to take a look at the law in just 1 second. So who is a required reporter of abuse and neglect? This is your list from the West Virginia law. Okay, just to recap on it. We have all medical, dental, and mental health professionals, with anyone that's working within the religious fields, school teachers and school personnel, school service workers, child care, foster care workers, EMS, peace officers, law officers, humane officers, judges, magistrates, employees from the juvenile services. And then this line is super important. Youth camp administrators or counselors, employees, coaches, or volunteers of any entity that provides organized activities for children. So you go back to all those slides before when I talked about looking at the things that you're involved with and thinking about whether they have policies and training mechanisms, because this is so important. Any entity that provides organized activities for children is a required reporter. Whoever volunteers there, whoever coaches there, whoever's involved with that process, that's every 4-H club, every Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, every mentoring program, every single sports league. Everyone involved within that process is a required reporter. And then you have your print processors there as well. So what is the timeline for reporting? This law has been simplified. It is just 24 hours. So 24 hours after suspecting abuse and neglect, you must report it to the DHHR. Very simple. okay? This is if we have reasonable cause to suspect that a child is being neglected or abused, sexually abused, physically abused, 24 hours after suspecting that abuse. Then, if it involves sexual abuse or physical abuse, not only must you report it to the DHHR, but you also must report it to the state police and law enforcement agency. This is because cross-reporting doesn't always occur. Sometimes, thankfully, most of the time, if the state police are involved in some type of issue that involves a child's well-being, they call CPS and they report it, and they get CPS involved. And on the flip side, when CPS has been brought in to address a situation and they find some type of criminal violation, they will call the police and report it themselves. But cross-reporting just doesn't always happen all the time. And when we need immediate response times and things like that, the rule is report it to both. Okay, so it should just be something that you think about. Listen, it's not our job as reporters to decide which one, who's going to respond, how it needs to be handled, what happens next. Thankfully, I'm thankful for that every single day, that it's not my job to decide what happens next. My job is to report it. I report it to CPS and I report it to the law enforcement agency. If you call, some people say, well, which law enforcement agency do I call? Just call your local law enforcement. They'll tell you if you have the wrong place. They might say, oh, that should be reported to this situation or to that, that's out of our jurisdiction. That's a city or that's a county. They'll tell you who to call. All right, reporting to superiors. County boards of education and private school administrators provide employees with a written statement that sets forth the requirements contained in West Virginia Code. And then they also want you to acknowledge that you understand what the policy said. So pretty much what the law is saying is that reporting up your chain is important. Okay, there's a lot of reasons that reporting up your chain is important. I'll use my organization as an example. If one of my volunteers sees abuse and neglect and needs to report that, and they call in, they make a report, and CPS calls my agency to get follow-up information, and I don't know what it is that was happening, then I can't really be helpful with the additional information. So I want my volunteers to make sure that they let me know when they think abuse and neglect has occurred and a report needs to be made. Same within a school system. Think about it. If a teacher calls and reports suspected abuse and neglect, that parent maybe the next day calls into the school to inquire about it, or maybe they're upset about it, and the person answering the phone send it to the principal or to the school counselor, and they aren't aware of what's happening, then we have a disconnect within our organizations. So reporting up the chain is important. But look at the italics on the bottom of the screen. It says, provided that notifying a person in charge does not exempt the person from making their mandate to report. So this goes back to Penn State scandals and USA Gymnastics and these different national entities where we have seen that reporting up the chain didn't get reported to the appropriate authorities, CPS and law enforcement. So you can report up your chain, but you also must report to CPS and law enforcement. When you report to the school counselor and to the principal, you guys can all work together to have the most comprehensive report to CPS. And so that's really important as we look at what is required in the report to CPS. Now you can have a very comprehensive picture of the report together, because you're going to get all of the information you need. Maybe that principal is well aware of other reports that have been made over time, or maybe the teacher from last year had similar concerns. So you guys would work together as an entity to make a great report to CPS. So you should report And contact CPS whenever you reasonably suspect a child has been abused or neglected or is subject to conditions where abuse and neglect is likely to occur. CPS's job is to take the report and determine, is the child safe or do they need protected? So we have a centralized intake in West Virginia. That's a call center that takes all the referrals for all 55 counties in West Virginia. A friend of mine that works in centralized intake, she reminded me that there's different options. When you call this hotline number, you're going to have different options. You want to select the Child Protective Services option. And she says, kind of silly, but just a reminder, just pushing option 4, which is other, will not get you to a person faster. Sometimes it will make your time longer in the waiting. So make sure that you're pushing the right button. So today I am not going to field questions about the fact that we make reports and CPS doesn't always accept the referrals, and there's a lot of case-by-case situations where we're frustrated because we don't think CPS is taking the cases that we need to take. Because my blanket answer to that is you don't always know what CPS is doing after you make your report. So when you make a report to CPS, you tell them who you are, that you're a mandated reporter, and you give them your contact information. They will send you a letter, and in that letter, it will state whether your report has been going to the next stage for investigation. Has it processed, or did it get screened out because it didn't meet the definition? Other than that, you don't know what happens next. If you think that nothing is happening, call again. If you think that nothing is happening and you're still having concerns, call again. Ultimately, you can always call your supervisors within your counties and have them check on things if you have a lot of concerns. So I get calls very often from colleagues in the area who are frustrated with the situation. Most of the time it's because we're not getting enough information for them to proceed, or it doesn't meet the definition. So let's look at that. CPS is accepting our report and determining, is the child safe or does the child need protected? They're looking at present dangers, immediate, significant, clearly observable family conditions or threats to child safety occurring in the present tense, endangering or threatening to endanger a child. Imminent danger, this is going to be when it's an emergency situation where the welfare or the life of the child is threatened. So some examples: non-accidental trauma inflicted by a parent, guardian, or sibling, or a babysitter. Combination of physical and other signs of pattern of abuse. Nutritional deprivation, abandonment, inadequate treatment of serious illness, substantial emotional injury, sale of a child, when the parent or guardian's abuse of alcohol or drugs has impaired their ability to parent. All of those things are things that they're looking at. When we make our reports, we want to be prepared and detailed. So that means pull your stuff together before making the referral. So that's why I give the example of going down to your administrator's office and getting the child's file out and have all the information ready. You want to have the last name of the caregiver. They're not always the same as the last name as the child. You want to know their address, telephone number. You want to know, are there any hazards to the worker? Do you know of guns or violence? Those are all questions that they're going to ask. And it's okay if you don't know some of the answers to the questions, but being prepared will give us the most complete report we possibly can. You want to know the demographics of the family, who lives in the home, who are the adults, who are the children. I mean, dates of birth and ages are fantastic because then they can link those reports to other reports or concerns within their system. Narrative. When did the incident occur? Are there injuries? Describe those injuries in detail. It's a bruise, purple in color, the size of a quarter, on their arm. Living conditions. Describe in detail. Does the home have utilities? Is there trash or feces, urine throughout the home? Enough food in the home? any knowledge that you have of their CPS history. So you could say, I believe CPS was involved with this family last year. This family reunified recently. These kids just went home to mom, and within 3 months, we're having the same situation occur that happened that caused the removal in the first place. Substance use, who's using the substances? How often are they using them? What type of substances are being used? Do the kids have access? Are the kids aware of the use? Domestic violence, are the parents or children injured within the altercation? Are the kids present for the domestic violence? Do they try to intervene? How often does it occur? Was law enforcement involved? Educational, how are the children's grades? What is the truancy rate? What are the excused or unexcused absences look like? How is truancy affecting the grades? How is truancy affecting their mental health, social health? And then also information on the child's functioning. Are they in special education? Do they have diagnoses? Do they use medication? Are there medical issues? All of these things are great information to provide in making your report to help a case, the intake worker be able to determine whether intervention or investigation needs to occur. So what's our liability? If you're making a report in good faith, then you're immune from civil or criminal liability. So just to think about it, nosy neighbors, custody battles, calling on your ex, those are all things that could create a liability for you. So you cannot just call to be a pain in the ass. In fact, I know cases in which the parents were doing that, calling each other constantly in custody cases, and the family court judge sent that case up to the circuit court to be addressed in circuit court, abuse and neglect. So, too many false reports in a custody case can get you in some serious trouble. Mandated reporters, I already said this, but mandated reporters can get notice whether their report was accepted for investigation. But that's it. Mandated reporters are not going to be told about the services offered, about the safety plans that are happening. Just because you are the person that initiated the investigation by making a report does not mean you're entitled to continue to know the information. The other thing that's important to know is that your information, the fact that you made the report to begin with, cannot be shared with the parents. But I make sure that I tell you that context clues do happen. So when a child goes to school in the morning, the black eye, and comes home with CPS involvement, likelihood that the reporter came from the school is high. So the CPS worker doesn't say, Miss Betty, Smith from the school called on this little girl. But the reality is, obviously, the child went, the school had concerns, they called, and the reporter is from the schools. So I hear that a lot from mandated reporters, that they say the CPS told them who called. But that is not permitted by policy. So what happens next? When someone makes a report to Child Protective Services, the Child Protective Services worker is going to interview the reporter to determine whether the child has been abused or neglected, as defined by state statute. If the report doesn't suggest that the child has been abused or neglected, or is likely to be abused or neglected, the report is screened out. If the report is accepted, it's assigned to a Child Protective Services social worker in the county that the abuse is alleged to occur. Unless there's a conflict, then it could be sent to a different county. That worker is going to complete what we call a family functioning assessment. That's interviews of the child, the siblings, the parents, caregivers, alleged abusers, and any persons that have information about the suspected maltreatment. This information is used to determine if a child is unsafe. And Child Protective Services policy describes what unsafe children are. So usually it does take some time, and we know we have backlog in our state, but usually we got about 30 days for a family functioning assessment. It doesn't mean that intervention doesn't happen within that. I mean, I've had cases where the petition is filed and the removal of the child happens before the completed report is done. So I don't want you to think that it takes 30 days to get any help for a family or to intervene. But getting all of those reports and everything done does take time. So once that family functioning assessment is completed, we're determining whether a child was abused or neglected, and then whether that child is unsafe. So once a case is opened, workers can provide for or arrange for services that enable the parents to provide appropriate care to their kids, making sure that their kids are safe and that the risk of maltreatment is reduced. So in some situations, they're referring them to participate in some programming, some parenting, some adult life skills. They are going to ask them to do some drug screens, check in on them, get rid of the boyfriend, clean up the house. There are different things that are occurring, and that doesn't mean that the children have to be removed. Removal of children from the home is a last case scenario. Most cases do not have any type of removal that is happening. So although most cases don't require court involvement, sometimes we do have to get the court involved. And that's because we need the court to force the parents to participate in services or, indefinitely to protect the child. So if mom can't get rid of the boyfriend or clean up the house or get the utilities turned back on or agree to go to treatment or have grandma help her, keep the kids safe, then we might have to file a petition in order to protect those children. I say we as a system. The department, the DHHR, is going to initiate this court involvement when a child is unsafe and cannot be protected in their home. And then in those cases, there can be a request for a transfer of custody for the child to the department, and then the child will be placed in with relatives or foster care. So understand that's a very small portion of the huge number of cases that are referred to CPS. So failing to report. There are penalties, and I think we're starting to see that people are being held accountable. We've seen a few cases throughout our state in the past couple of years where someone has not reported in the time frame that's required. So just to let you know, any person, official or institution required by law to report a case involving a child known or suspected to be abused or neglected who knowingly fails to do so or knowingly prevents another person from acting reasonably from doing so is guilty of a misdemeanor and upon conviction shall be confined in jail not more than 90 days or fined not more than $5,000 or both fined and confined. And then if it's a sexual abuse situation, the penalty is larger. So you could have jail up to 6 months, fine of up to $10,000 or both. More than 80% of sexual abuse incidences happen in isolated one-on-one situations. So if we can eliminate or reduce isolated one-on-one situations, we're going to dramatically lower the risk. All of our encounters with children should be observable and interruptible. Think about what that looks like in your institutions that you work in, your agencies, your schools, your churches, and your volunteer leagues. And this is one of the ones I get the biggest pushback on. I had an opportunity to work with our baseball association, and a pitching coach who's hired by parents to do one-on-one pitching lessons really pushed back with me on this. And we had a great opportunity for us to think about it, because he said, they hire me to do one-on-one. And I said, well, they don't hire you to come into a situation where nobody has access to what you're seeing, what you're doing with that kid. You pitch, you practice out in the backyard, or you have a facility in which you go to, anybody should be able to walk into. You are working in the batting cages at the field. If you're renting a gym, and this is a situation, this guy was renting a gym, having kids come on one-on-one. He didn't want the parents there for a lot of reasons, because parents are a pain in the butt whenever we want to, we don't think our kid is working hard enough or paying attention well enough, so he didn't want the parents to be there. And I understand that. So I really encouraged him to think about other ways to do this. And so my husband was also doing some small group instruction with kids getting ready for ball season. So I said, why don't you guys pair up? He has half the gym to work on small group instruction. You have half the gym to work on your pitching classes. And now you have 2 adults there, multiple children, and now we're observable and interruptible. So there's ways to think around this. And I encourage you to be creative, to really challenge the belief that we can't have observable and interruptible. We want to pay attention to gut feelings. Oh, let me just back up real quick and say, it's not because we don't trust anyone. It's not that I don't trust that pitching coach. It's not that you shouldn't trust my husband to be able to do these small group instructions. That's not what it's about. People say, but I've known him my whole life. I trust him with my kids. I'm glad that you have people like that in your child's life, because that's what children need for resiliency. They need those adult connections. What I'm saying is create an environment where the person who's there for the wrong reasons can't get into your institution, because they're looking for the opportunities in organizations that don't have these strong rules. So we want to create strong organizations that say, no, if I walk in, I try to get into a classroom where a kid and a teacher are in there with the door shut or locked by themselves, then that is telling me that you're doing something inappropriate, because that's against our policy and it's against what we're trying to create as a safe organization. So I just want to put that out there. Pay attention to gut feelings. Acknowledge a child's resistance to a specific person or situation. Don't hug or don't force a child to hug or kiss anyone. I don't know about all you guys, but I grew up in the realm of, like, my mom would have Tupperware parties, right? And so she'd be having her Tupperware parties. They're there eating their cheesecake and drinking their punch and they're hanging out. It was us kids' bedtime, and my mom would say, get ready for bed, and then come out and give everybody, hug and kiss and say goodnight. And like, we literally had to make the rounds at the Tupperware party for people we didn't know, or maybe kind of knew. They went to my mom, went to church with us, but didn't have a relationship. It's super awkward, but it was just a requirement. And I never thought twice really about it. We don't do that anymore with our kids, and we don't force them to hug or kiss anyone, let alone people that they don't have relationships that involve that physical comfort. Talk to your kids about body safety. The earlier you start this, the easier it will be. I'm telling you what a difficult conversation to, I do this for a living, yet when it came time to really talk to my son as he was starting into elementary school and really for the first time doing things like going to practice on his own, having this conversation is kind of awkward. But you got to tell them about the fact that you'll believe them no matter who it is. If it's a coach, if it's a Boy Scout leader, if it's someone from your church, no matter who it is, if it's your husband, if it's your boyfriend, I will believe you. Use the correct name for body parts from day one. Use the correct name for body parts. And talk to your kids about using the word surprise instead of secrets. So if we could erase this secrets language, it would be fantastic for our children. Secrets are something that are not intended to tell. That is between 2 people. But if we say surprises, then that means that ultimately, eventually, we're going to tell. And so if your kid is being compelled to keep something from you, but they know secrets are not something that you do in your household, they're more likely to have that conversation. So thinking about this unusual time where we've had to completely change the way we interact with children, our lessons plans, our activities, the discussions, they look very different than they did just a few months ago, weeks ago. And we're treading through this new space. It's important to remember that in your physical classroom, your office environment, we had rules about child protective policies. Those rules have to be applied in our digital or virtual environment, but we're going to have to tweak them And we're going to add new rules and new policies and think about the way that we're doing these things. So next week, I'm talking about common adult boundary violations and online safety protocols that we can use for teachers, parents, and students. And we're going to apply that to both like telehealth and therapy and things like that. So I just want to say, like, I'm deeply grateful for the work that our social workers and judges and teachers and principals and daycare workers and all the organizations that are working very hard to support children and families affected by abuse and neglect. We're texting, teaching, tutoring, delivering packages, staying in touch with these kids. You guys are the unsung heroes. And so thank you so much for helping our children be happy and healthy, thriving and safe. And I encourage you that as we walk this uncertain path together, please take time to show compassion, care, concern to the most vulnerable among us. Be watchful, vigilant, and mindful of the need to protect our children and keep them safe, both now and beyond COVID-19. We can work together to prevent child abuse and neglect every day. I'm putting a few other places where you can go for more information. Prevent Child Abuse West Virginia has a website. Darkness to Light has a website and trainings there. You have partners and prevention teams in almost every county. I encourage you to reach out to them if you want help in getting this type of training out to your community members. Your family resource networks, your child advocacy centers, and your CASA programs are all there to support this important work. And then I'm gonna do questions and answers, and I'm gonna leave this slide up with my contact information if you have specific contact questions.
Susan, it's Barb Tucker, and I've been watching the questions and the chat. Can you explain a little more about when you said to be interruptible, please?
Sure. Interruptible means I can walk in anytime. So if I'm doing a tutoring session with a kid, I probably don't want a whole lot of interruptions. Let's say I'm working in an after-school program, and there's, you know, you have your main room for the after-school program, the big cafeteria maybe at your school or your gym, but tutoring sessions are happening in, you know, kind of other classrooms maybe that are near the gym. If it's important for me to have that time where I'm in the classroom in a one-on-one situation with the kid, I would encourage you not to do that. But I understand if your kid is struggling with math and they're going to be working with their tutor on math skills, watching all the other kids jump rope and play in the gym is probably not that conducive to learning. So if you go, let's say you're using that classroom door should be open and anyone can walk through it at any point in time. You can sit, you know, position in the desk so it's right in, you know, when you look in the classroom type thing. So just interruptible means I can walk in.
Great, thank you. Mel, do you have some more?
I'm looking right now in the Q&A box. Could you go back over secrets versus surprises, and can you give an example of what we should say to our own children?
Yeah, fantastic. So really simple. My husband wants to plan a surprise for mommy. Mother's Day, Christmas, birthdays. Heck, we know our kids do not keep those secrets. They make you something, they tell you. They go to the store, dad, to buy something, they tell you. But maybe as they're getting a little bit older, dad's able to say, like, come on, like, this is a secret. This is between me and you. We're working on this project. We can't tell mommy about it. We don't want to use the secret word for that. We want to use the surprise word because eventually we are going to tell mommy. We're just trying to keep it a surprise, which means we're going to be working on this for this month, and at the end of the month we're going to give it to her for her birthday or for Mother's Day. It's just changing the word from let's keep it a secret from mom to keeping it a surprise for mom. Once we've ingrained that terminology with our kids, then when they're out and someone says, hey, you know, I'll let you, maybe they're at uncle's house or something like that, and uncle is going, and next week we're really going to talk about this a lot in the boundary violations. But so uncle says, I want you to keep this a secret from your mom. I'm going to let you stay up late, and I'm going to let you watch that movie that mom doesn't allow you to watch. It is our secret. You don't tell your mom, because I'll get in trouble. You'll get in big trouble if she knows that you watch this. So it is our secret. That's the kind of language we're trying to eliminate. So if your kid knows that secrets aren't something that you're supposed to have from your parents, then that should be a red flag. Hopefully that clears that up. We'll talk about that a lot next week. That's a great adult boundary, because that's what the perpetrator is going to try to do. They're going to break down those things that you have talked to your kids about.
Okay, Susan, so we have another one, and this comes up a lot. If a mother is using drugs while she is pregnant and then the baby is born addicted, does CPS normally remove the baby from the parent?
Great question. That comes up a lot. There's a lot of factors that go into that. That is not just cut and dry, mom test positive, baby test positive at birth, should they remove? There's a lot more that goes into it. Is the mom in treatment? Is the mom and baby bonding in the hospital? Did mom give birth to that baby and then waddle herself out of the hospital so she could get out in the parking lot to smoke on her crack pipe before she heads back in? Is her use pervasive to the point where she is not able to even parent while in the hospital? There are a lot of programs across our state working on this. And so if mom and baby are able to bond in the hospital, mom is able to parent in the hospital, mom is enrolled in some type of treatment or agreeable to treatment, mom has a safety net at home to keep that child safe. So you have, a supportive spouse, you have grandparents involved. There's a lot of factors that could keep that child from having to be removed at birth.
Okay, now one more here is, how about meeting with a high school counselor with the door shut, but there is a window in the door and you keep it unlocked, especially if it is a topic for the student that they don't want to answer, that they don't want others to hear?
Yeah, to me, that's
Yes.
observable. That's observable and interruptible. Anyone can walk in, doors unlocked, people can peek in, they can see what's going on. Observable, interruptible.
So I did have somebody mention that if you want to go ahead and stop sharing your screen for a moment, Susan,
Yep.
your information is there. As Susan mentioned, first of all, in closing here, I just want to thank everybody for participating. If you're still on, Susan mentioned last week the topic that we're going to be covering. We're going to go a lot into boundary violations. Somebody did do a comment that talked about that secrets portion and how important that is for teachers to have that training. So as Susan mentioned earlier in her PowerPoint, there is linkage to the Department of Ed's policy following Aaron Marin's law, but we do understand, as many of us who do prevention education as part of our work, we do understand that oftentimes you need more training and you need to be able to have somebody who can filter questions just like Susan did today. So please hang on to contact information. As a Darkness to Light facilitator, I can provide you information on who your facilitators are that can do that training for you and for your schools throughout your state. So just reach out to one of us. If there are any other questions that are in there, I do want to remind everybody to make sure that you got into the sign-in sheet and the evaluation to let us know if you didn't. We hope that you'll join us next week. If you are staying on the line for grad credit, we're going to hand it over to Selena in a moment. I'm just going to give Susan one more question because I know how important these questions are. Oftentimes when a child discloses at school, they're asked to share the trauma with staff and administration on site, creating it difficult to disclose at a CAC. Any advice?
Yeah, I think that you need to look at the policies that you have within your county system. As always, there's best practices out there, and not every school is, or not every school, every county, we're not always doing best practices. So I would work on creating, sitting down, bring your school system, your CAC, your prosecutors, your law enforcement. There are MDITs that are already created in every county, and I would be having that conversation of how can we do a better job. so that we're not doing that. Because you're right, the whole point is that kids aren't having to say it over and over and over. So use that team, that MDI team, to create better policies within your county.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Susan. We so appreciate you taking the time this morning. I really encourage all of you to hang on to our contact information, because oftentimes topics like we discussed today, a few months from now, you find yourself in a situation, and one of the reasons we wanted to do this training series was to give you points of contact to reach out to when you are actually find yourself in situations and you need a sounding board to help you know what to do next. So I really encourage you to hang on to our information. We're going to say goodbye to those of you who are not staying online for the graduate credit. Any questions you have, just let us know. Thank you so much, Susan. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on today. I'll see you guys next week.